hopefully my childhood, which was spent on a river and not at school, won't show now. But hopefully I've re-educated myself in later life. As Mark said, I've been with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust since 1998. And one thing that's borne into me over that time is that the underlying principle of GWCT and its research is that it always has been based on the concept of applied science. Any research we do has to be applied. It has to have a management outlet and to answer that so what question. This is why we are so excited about formation of the Alliance and the concept we form together, which is basically exactly the concept of applied science within the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. As Colin has explained, there is much to do going forward, but now Louise and I will show you what the Alliance partners are currently doing together to provide evidence to populate the likely suspects framework. This is work that we're actually doing now. We have two major projects, the Moray Firth project on the east coast of Scotland and the Salmonid Management Round the Channel project, abbreviated SAMARSH, in the south of England. We are all well aware that our migratory salmonids have a complex life cycle, incorporating rivers, estuary, and the sea. However, what is even more complex is interactions between their life cycle and the organizations that manage their environment and the other animals and fish that share their world. If we are to make a difference, we need to influence these organizations, and the only way to achieve this is through gathering scientific evidence and working together. We need to provide that evidence, and this is what we aim to do as a partnership and to inform that likely suspects framework. So, are we losing fish in the river, the estuary, or the sea? Many hide behind the climate change scenario, shrug their shoulders, and say nothing can be done. However, as you will see shortly, we are losing a lot of our smolts in fresh water, even before they leave the river. This is close at home and something we may well have control over. We have control over these man-made impacts. To give you examples of what we are currently doing, firstly, I will explain our work around the issue of coastal netting and the loss of adult fish. Then Louise will explain the work we are doing on assessing where we are losing our juvenile smolts. Salmon and sea trout are caught in commercial nets in our estuaries and the sea. And as you can see from this proud fisherman displaying his illegally caught fish, but how many of these fish are caught in our coastal nets? And what is the scale of the problem? Last summer, in partnership with the Environment Agency, our SAMARSH partners, we used 2 commercial fishermen in the south of England to set gill nets in popular commercial fishing areas using similar methods to catch bass, mullet, mackerel, and herring. They set 800 meters of gill nets between them in the evening and retrieved the nets the following day. In 23 of these overnight netting sessions between April and July, we caught 34 sea trout, 5 grilse, and 1 salmon. Now, you may not think that this is a huge total until you consider the volume of nets that are used around our coastline. We asked the local inshore fisheries conservation authority who managed coastal netting around Cornwall, how many nets are set off the coast of Cornwall in 1 week? Well, this is how many nets are set within 6 miles of the Cornish coast every week. Every 7 days, there are 2,500 nets set. Each net is around about 300 to 400 meters in length, and that equates to around about 1 million meters of nets. So we are very concerned about this issue, and we believe that this is where a large number of our adults and even juveniles, salmon and sea trout, are disappearing. Then, not just you have the inshore nets, you have the nets that are operating for bass and various fisheries beyond the 6 mile zone. Then there are the trawlers, the super trawlers. They are all taking their share of fish. So this is evidence that we are currently using to inform the coastal management of netting around our coast in England. And also we will be using this evidence and developing this work further afield around the UK as part of the likely suspects framework. Okay. Now Louise will explain the work we are doing to look at where we are losing our smolts and concentrate on the juveniles and what the nascent stages of work are within that we are currently doing at the moment.
All right, let's keep talking about the story that Dylan just presented. There was evidence gathered by the partners of this alliance that showed strong need to look at two main questions to try to have some impact on those Atlantic salmon and sea trout population. The first question that we needed to answer was, where do smolt go? We need to define their migration route if we want to design adequate management and conservation action. Then, we also need to answer what happens to them when they undertake migration. And to do so, there was two big tracking projects that was implemented to try to feed data and information to that likely suspect framework. The first one is Samarsh, which is a project that is located in the southern part of UK. And the second one is a Scottish project called the Morifert that tackles more the northern part of the UK. So you have two tracking projects that generate information at different scales. The Morifert project will include 7 rivers, so you're looking among different systems, whereas Samarsh is looking at 4. Both projects is multiple years studies. The Morifert includes 3 years of data, and it's ongoing, whereas Samarsh just finished it and has 2 years of data. So this allowed us to compare between 2 locations, north and south position in the UK. It allowed us to compare among systems, amongst rivers, and it allowed us to compare among years. So it helps us to tackle the complexity of natural systems. Systems has a lot of variation, and there is no such thing as a simple answer when you start to dig in and try to understand what's going on. So for someone like me, as a biologist, to have access to that much data that is generated from those projects, it's a gold mine. It empowered us to generate enough evidence to have some strong conclusion to the question that we're seeking for. Now, if I'm not convincing you yet that those projects are important to try to have a positive impact to the Atlantic salmon and sea trout population, let me introduce you to a video that was made based on the Morifert project in 2019, but it is highly transferable to Samarsh because both studies have the same kind of design, the same aim to answer a question that is related to smolt migration, so we can have a positive outcome on those populations. And let me introduce you how much effort and groundwork those projects needs to have a start and generate enough data.
Something spectacular has begun, and we want to share our work with you. We celebrate the success of an incredible year for the Missing Salmon Project, the largest European tagging and tracking project and the start of the Likely Suspects Framework. 850 salmon smolts were tagged in a determined effort to understand their migration routes and to identify where and why so many fish were going missing in action and what we can do about it. We set out with a plan. You supported us. And this is what we've achieved so far.
The Missing Salmon project is an ambitious and groundbreaking programme. For this project, we're using acoustic telemetry. It's a proven method for tracking fish through the rivers, the estuary and out into the ocean. In a huge collaboration with our partners, Glasgow University, Marine Scotland Science, Fisheries Trusts and Boards and the public, we deployed receivers by boat across the Inner Moray Firth, the Dornoch Firth and all the way from the east of Spey Bay across to Brora. We've also deployed a further line of receivers spanning 12 nautical miles directly north of Fraserburgh. At the same time, the teams worked tirelessly, travelling thousands of miles up and down the 7 river systems with the amazing people on those rivers deploying the receivers in strategic locations. This meticulously planned, complex and labour-intensive work was all executed in time for the spring migration of smolts. What was then involved was a sample of migrating smolts were intercepted across the 7 rivers by using smolt traps. We carefully fitted each smolt with a uniquely identifiable acoustic tag that each radiated a ping out into the water. These fish rejoin the migrating population and continue downstream towards the marine feeding grounds. As they navigate their way downstream, the receivers register these unique pings and store the information until the smolt migration has finished. Again, the people and organisations involved were so valuable to this process. Over 15 million pings were registered by our receivers during the course of this project. We are tirelessly and urgently analysing this huge amount of information from the project and what it all means. The initial results suggest higher than expected losses of smolts before they reach the salt water and much lower losses as they move out from the coast. We now know that around half our young salmon are missing in action as they move down the rivers towards the sea. The fish that do make it to the salt water move rapidly and appear to disperse and take a range of routes out into the firth towards the open ocean. Whilst these results are clearly concerning, it's exciting to know that we now have evidence and we're using that to guide future management and actually help with positive changes.
So, what's next? What we need to do in year 2 is to dig deeper to find out why these losses are happening. For example, are they related to river conditions, predation, or just a part of life?
We shouldn't jump to conclusions, as there's still a lot of thorough detailing and checking to do before we can bring you the final findings of this project. What management actions have to be made to help stop this iconic fish from missing out on a future?
It's not a secret that our salmon are in crisis. Only by pulling together our expertise, knowledge and resources can we give salmon the best chance in the future. In order to expand and achieve all that we hope to achieve, we have formed the Missing Salmon Alliance, as it represents the most sensible and proactive way to understand what is causing this crisis and lobby for change. We look forward to sharing more evidence as it becomes available, and also share how this information will be used to answer more questions, to form better management, and most importantly, putting wild salmon first.
All right, let's highlight some of the knowledge that was generated with those 2 tracking projects that was quickly presented in this video. Let me walk you through what we were doing. So in this animation, we have a fish that just got tagged in the Spey River in the Moray Firth. That fish is broadcasting a signal. And as this fish is migrating in the river through the marine environment, those receivers that are represented in red pick up that signals, and we can track each fish throughout all their migration. We generated around 15 million detection this year just in the Moray Firth in 2019. So from those data, if we go on the next side of the slide, we have a graph that generates some answers that we're looking for. So we have the fish that we tag and release in the initial site location of the river. And from that, we can track them, and we know that around 50% of the fish in the Moray Firth that was tagged made it to the mouth of the river, which means that half of the fish that we tagged are missing in action in the river alone. We also know that from the fish that we release at the top of the river, that 40% of them made it to the marine environment, which means that if the fish made it to the mouth of the river, the likelihood for them to make it to the marine environment was high. The level of missing smolt salmon there was not as important than the one we saw in the freshwater. And these results are consistent with what we saw with the March project. The March project was designed to tackle mostly the migration in the marine environment, because initially that's what we thought the losses were going to be important. So they designed their project to tag fish and release them at the mouth of the river in a tidal environment. And that project demonstrated that 70 to 85% of the fish that were tagged survived. So we had a high level of confirmed fish that were making their migration through the marine environment. If we summarize this knowledge that we generated with those two tracking projects in the context of the question that we were asking at the beginning of this presentation, we now know where the fish are being lost. The Moray Firth demonstrated that there's a high level of missing smoked salmon in the river, whereas both Samarsh and the Moray Firth project demonstrated that actually the level of missing smoked salmon in the estuary zone are not as important compared to the freshwater environment. Now, the next step is to try to understand why this pattern exists. And that leads us to the plan for 2020, where we're going to focus on the river based on a result that we got from 2019 and trying to understand why these patterns exist. We're going to look at different factors that are related to the freshwater environment, such as river condition and environmental variation, temperature, precipitation, looking at some likely suspects, such as predation, which will both include aquatic and avian, or just looking if it's part of life. Is it something that it is new or that already always existed and we didn't know about it? And that's what science does, especially in the context of those two tracking projects. It tried to generate enough information that we can arrive at some conclusion that maximize the likelihood to have a positive outcome to those Atlantic salmon and sea trout population. Thank you.